I hope this recording actually works. I haven't done this in ages, so fingers crossed. Anyway, the main topic of tomorrow's paper is growth, so that will be a really important thing to know. And you've seen the advanced information as a group chat earlier, you need to know about growth. So, how do economies grow? One of the main ways an economy can grow is through investment. China, Hong Kong, and Singapore are three in the top 10. They're not the top three, but all are in the top 10 of FDI and have massive growth as a result. As we know, China is one of the fastest growing economies. It's slowing down greatly, but we'll get to that later. Hong Kong, very strong economy, service sector based, financial sector based. Really important and strong economy, gets a hell of a lot of FDI. Same with Singapore, because Singapore is a bit of a tax haven, so they get a lot of investment, and that is one of the biggest ways an economy can grow. Increased or decreased regulation can also be a way an economy can grow. If firms have an easier way of sorry if you can see that on the recording, just checking that my voice is being captured. Increased or decreased regulation can be one of the most important ways of economic growth. Increasing regulation can lead to economic growth through stuff like wages, so that can be an argument for increased regulation and economic growth. It can also lead to less negative, demerit goods being produced, which negatively affects health. So if you ban smoking, that could lead to economic growth as people are healthier in the economy, which we'll also get to later. Decreased regulation can also be a major thing, as it will be cheaper for firms to, to produce materials. It will be cheaper, it will be easier. This increases productivity, and productivity is really, really important to growing economies. Without it, your economy isn't going to grow. So productivity through deregulation, stuff like removal of workers' safety. So decreased safety rights will lead to economic growth because of extra productivity. You can obviously argue the counter to that, and I advise arguing the counter to that. Death, I guess, can be seen as a negative thing. Decreased regulation in terms of green emission, like green policies. Decreased regulation for polluting rivers or emitting CO2. If that is removed, you'll have further economic growth, as firms it's cheaper to use coal, etc., than install and solar panels, stuff like that. You got the exploitation of natural resources. This is the fundamental thing to how all economies start to grow. Very few economies start in the service sector, unless you're like Singapore or Kuwait, but that's because they became independent with the foundation already built. So exploitation of natural resources is the very basis of how economies grow. If you're extracting iron, coal, etc., etc., that is going to be how your economy is growing, because you can export that. You can create domestic production change. So if I mine iron, I can make it into steel, etc., domestically or through foreign countries. That's another big thing with oil-based economies. They extract the oil and export it and make a shit ton of money, or they also refine it domestically. So the exploitation of natural resources provides jobs. It increases the amount of reserve currency of foreign currencies, because oh, hello Matty, do ask any questions if you want. So yeah, natural resources are a massive way of growing economies. Innovation is big as well. This is typically service sector economies with innovation. So we are not an innovative economy at all. Places like China, Japan, Germany are very, very innovation based. If you innovate something domestically, if a firm innovates something domestically, that can give domestic firms a massive, like, competitive and comparative advantage internationally in producing that good. So if we create a new way of, I don't know, a new computer chip or something, that's going to give all our the domestic firm that found that new way to make the computer work a hell of a lot of money. It's going to increase domestic competition because of international free copyright, stuff like that, and loads of other things that I won't bore you to death, but these are for the main ways economies can grow. Factors that can lead to economic growth. Independent financial institutions. These are very, very important, although it's a bit difficult to understand why. Independent financial institutions. So essentially, this Bank of England is really, really important that it's independent, because you can have governments, if a government has the control over the interest rate, which is, remember, used to control inflation, the government will usually lower it to boost the economy and it will look good, yeah, even though it's causing inflation. However, independent financial institutions like the Bank of England, they don't have that external influence. Johnson can't walk into the Bank of England and demand they do something. There's a representative from the government there, but he can't vote. He just can't remember his name, but he basically just goes and say, "This is our fiscal plan. Change the monetary policy accordingly." And yeah, so independent financial institutions are crucial because you do not want a politicized interest rate. Turkey does not have an independent central bank. Okay, Turkey's central bank is very, very much controlled by the government, and everyone who disagrees with Erdogan, who is the Turkish leader, gets fired. Inflation in Turkey is at 73%. It is way more than that, but they just won't admit it. It's well over 100, some say 120% inflation. And they lowered their interest rate, which is the exact opposite of what you want to do when you have high inflation. So you need to understand that although it seems a bit like it might not come out, it could, if it talks about financial institutions, which is in the advanced information and the paper 3 topic thing. Which says it's going to be focusing on growth. Stable government is very much a crucial one to, economic growth, because if you have an unstable government, you're not going to know the future of the economy, and that's a massive part of investment. If you are a country like Myanmar, who has recently had a coup, virtually all the foreign direct investment there has disappeared because they don't know what the future is going to be. However, with democracies in the US, the UK, France, etc., they're stable. You're not going to have a military coup in the US. Well, you were close to it, and you could see that reflected. As that was going on, as the storming of the Capitol was going on, markets went into a shock. So stable government is massive. If you have a stable government, you will have foreign direct investment and economic growth. But if you're a dictatorship like Eritrea, who has one of the worst economic growth in the world, if not, one of the worst, they're a military dictatorship and coups every 5 minutes. So, if your government is stable, markets won't feel shocks. Okay. Infrastructure is very, very important because you need to, actually be able to transport goods around inside the economy. So I need to be able to transport my goods from, don't know, London to Manchester. Otherwise, I'm not going to actually sell those goods. So infrastructure is crucial towards economic growth. Countries like Mozambique, who have very, very bad infrastructure, you can see that split. So the coastline around the capital of Mozambique is relatively wealthy compared to the inland of Mozambique, who is very very impoverished comparatively, because there's virtually no road that goes from the capital of Mozambique inland. So infrastructure is important. And infrastructure is also important to exporting goods. So having a port, having a functioning and big port is crucial. Having airports is also important as well, which is why there was so much want to expand Heathrow, because we're going to get more tourists, we're going to be able to transport more goods by plane. So, infrastructure is one of the fundamentals to economic growth. Education, pretty self-explanatory. You're not going to be able to have a service sector if no one can do maths. People have got to read and write to do any job, pretty much. Health, that links a lot into productivity. If you've got, diseases going around, you're going to have a really unproductive workforce, because people are going to need to go to hospital, and if there's no hospital around, they can't work. There's a very high job turnover because of death in some countries. So health is also one incredibly important way to explain economic growth, or the lack thereof. You need to be able to explain all of these in the exam, because if it talks about, why is investment, what, if it's like an 8 marker that talks about what factors influence either economic growth or, more firms opening in the country, or like we saw in a different paper, I think, or it was a practice paper I did, you had a question about what influences firms to move to a specific country. So, yeah. How it's measured, you got HDI, which three of the cool things of HDI: life expectancy, gross national income, which is the same as GDP per capita, and years in school. So years in school, how educated you are. If you've got an educated workforce, you can, actually have high level jobs. You will have a functioning bureaucracy. You'll be able to have a competitive labour market. Gross national income, GDP per capita, pretty self-explanatory. The wealth of the nation and people in the nation. You got life expectancy as well. If the economy is massively hampered by stuff like child mortality, and death at young ages, because people can't become specialised. And I know it seems a bit dreary that I'm talking about death in productivity, but since it's economics, you kind of have to. People can't become specialised, people can't become efficient if they're dying at a very young age. So you have, I don't know, a teacher that could work for 40 years, become highly specialised. That doesn't happen if the life expectancy is 40 or 50, is it? So, very important to bring in life expectancy. 0 to 0.49 is low HDI. 0.5 to 0.69 is medium HDI. 0.7 to 0.79 is high. and above 8 is very high. So typically countries with above 8 are, developed economies. You've got Denmark in there, which we saw in paper 2. Norway, Iceland is Iceland with the highest HDI in the world. Switzerland's up there, Sweden's up there. So yeah, evaluation of HDI, because you've got to be able to criticize what you're using in the exam. It is broad, okay? It doesn't look at the micro indicators of the economy. It doesn't look at unemployment. It doesn't look at, stability of the government, etc. However, that can be good because it allows you to compare it to each country quite easily. So yeah.
You go back to the other slide quickly. Just one before. Yeah, that.
Yeah, what on here?
Just need to get down the numbers.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So typically, I'll send this PowerPoint to the group chat and on the Discord as well. But yeah, it might be useful to know these numbers if it talks about measuring inequality or measuring equality of life, stuff like that. So yeah, let me know when you got it, Lewis.
Yeah, I got it.
Right. Right, so it can be good that it's broad, it allows comparison of countries, and it can be bad because it ignores a lot of stuff. The quality of the education isn't taken into account, so they can be in school for 18 years, but if the quality of education isn't good, or it's in some countries like Afghanistan where women can't enter the education, that's not taken into account. So actually it might be, I'm not entirely, I don't use that as an example, so I'm not 100%, but HDI, it doesn't take in the the intricacies and the actual micro areas of education. Good because it allows measuring over time, because HDI is typically measured either yearly or every few years. Doesn't take into share of wealth, which is a wider issue with GDP per capita. GDP per capita does not take into account the Gini coefficient or the Lorenz curve of the nation. So it does, if 99% of the country has 1% of the wealth and 1% has 99% of the wealth, HDI doesn't take that into account, and it ignores stuff like crime, which is a massive part of the human development. So if there's massive amounts of crime, you're not going to have a developed economy, because no one's going to want to invest into an economy when their investments could be stolen.
Hi guys.
Right, Johnny, back from your dog walk. I am recording, so you can see the first part of this as well.
Nice.
You've got more measurements of economic growth. You've got GDP. You all know what GDP is. GDP per capita we've explained, and standard of living. So stuff like shelter, housing quality, ability to purchase necessities and luxuries are included in standard of living. And you've got highest GDP growth, real GDP growth. And you can understand with a lot of these are actually incredibly impoverished countries, bar like South Sudan, Rwanda, Ethiopia a bit, Nepal a bit, but they are relatively impoverished countries. So GDP can be criticized because, the richest countries will tend to have smaller percentages of growth, because it's difficult to grow an economy that's already very, very big, because of the sheer levels of competition. Economic impact on individuals, firms, and global economies. So you got the thing that Sarah always says: the US catches a cold, the UK gets pneumonia. For example, the 2008 financial crisis. This should have really been a US only thing, because it was their firms that were breaking the law, their firms that were lying, etc. But, you know, it toppled economies globally. Like, we survived it quite easily, but the knock-on effects were the EU debt crisis, and that cost tens of billions of euros to solve, if not hundreds. You got cost push competition, which I know sounds a bit odd, but it's basically taking cost push inflation and thinking, if more countries are, you know, exploiting their natural resources, you're going to have further competition of those natural resources that will decrease the price. So you got the cost push of competition. If there's more competition from the beginning of production chains, the whole production lane is going to become cheaper. If iron is cheaper, or let's say oil, if oil is cheaper, then you're going to have cheaper petrol, cheaper crude oil, cheaper plastics, stuff like that. So a good thing to know about economies is that you can link it back to the very beginning of the production chain. Okay, that's an impact on the global economy. For instance, if I don't know, Russia doubles its oil production, then you're going to have a lot more competition internationally. You're going to decrease the price of oil a lot. And that ties into global competition of firms, because, you know, if you have, the more trade agreements you have, the more competition you're going to have, and what these trade agreements are is going to be a large determinant of how much competition there is. So yeah, competition is very important. Global competition is important to know, because when we were in the EU, our firms had a lot more competition to deal with. Now that we've left, we have less competition to deal with. However, a hell of a lot of our banks left for Frankfurt in Germany. So that's a good way to think about global competition, is that because we left the EU and we had that sudden reduction in trade agreements, because we were part of the single market, which was one big trade agreement, and then we left, most of our banks just left London. I think we went from 7 of the 10 largest banks to 3 or 4 of the 10 largest banks in the world in London, because they all just left for Frankfurt in Germany, because there they can actually access consumers and other companies much easier. Did I do individuals? Oh no. But you know, global competition ties into individuals, and more trade agreements and more competition you have globally, the cheaper goods are going to be for individuals. However, there is an opposite side to this, which is the argument for protectionism. Okay, because remember, you got interventionism, which is for domestic intervention by the government, and you've got protectionism, which is intervention by the government on a national, like international scale. So if I intervene, I might save an individual firm from bankruptcy. If I protect the economy, I might implement a tariff on a different country. A tariff diagram would also, and a free trade diagram, those two can be very useful. If you want to get fancy with your diagrams, I recommend liquidity trap. I will try and find the Econ Plus DAO video where I explain the liquidity trap diagram. Okay, you got financial institutions. You got the Bank of England, independent, massively important to economic growth. Because it's independent, you've got a certain amount of confidence that brings into the economy, because you know that they're going to be making the best decision they can based on empirical evidence, which means, you know, with that they're using what they have to make the best decision and using what they know. That provides confidence in the economy. Unlike Turkey, whose president essentially decides the interest rates, and that is currently collapsing the economy. literally collapsing it. You got three very important global institutions. You've got the World Trade Organization. It sets out the rules for trade, so it sets out what trade deals can do, how people can trade, who can trade, etc. So that is really, really important to watch a 5-minute video explaining its job. Provides a universal legal trade platform. So it essentially says this is how trade agreements between governments work, and it's universal. I only think two countries aren't part of it, but yeah. However, you can argue that it's pretty useless because China broke its rules and didn't get anything in retaliation a few years back. The World Bank bails out liberal countries that keep spending money. So the World Bank is basically just a global lender of last resort. Okay. The IMF gives cheap investments to countries, okay, but it also bails them out. It works in conjunction with the World Bank to bail countries out. The cheap investments bit is really important because I'll tell you why it's important in a minute, but it basically helps a lot of countries. I mean, we've been bailed out by the IMF under John Major's government. We took out a loan from the IMF to make sure we didn't go bankrupt. So, they're very, very useful. Good number to know. Global inflation average 7.4. It's not to do with financial institutions, but that's a good number to know. 7.4 global inflation rate. Okay, so that's just an average of everyone. Then you got exchange rates. So this is also in the advanced information. And let me find the advanced information quickly. Yeah, because you've got this here, growing economies, trading blocks, and exchange rate changes. I think that might be an essay, just based on how might trading blocks affect exchange rates, for example. It will give you a extract, so use it, but I reckon these three will be combined into an essay. So using ideas of globalization, explaining why trading blocks have an effect on the exchange rate. The exchange rate is a cost of buying one currency with another. So there's an exchange rate between the British pound, or the pound sterling, and the US dollar. Because if I want to go to America, I can't use pounds, British pounds, to buy something in America. So I have to buy US dollars with pounds. Okay? So that can, and that, it ties in a lot with Whipperdeck and Spiced. It can be massively influenced by trade, okay? Export-focused economies are going to have a very high demand for their currency. If you look at China, they have a high demand for their currency. Look at the US, high demand for their currency, because they are export-focused economies, because they export billions, or trillions, actually, in the case of the US. So it very, very heavily influenced by trade. If you have very, very low exports and very, very high imports, you're going to have a weak currency. Okay. It can be influenced through interest rates as well. Higher interest rates will lead to a stronger currency. Lower interest rates will lead to a weaker one. You got weak pound, imports dearer, exports cheaper. Strong pound, imports cheaper, exports dearer. So, for instance, I'll give you a couple of examples by showing different things. If the British pound appreciates, so gets stronger and is worth more compared to the euro, it will make imports cheaper. Okay, so for instance, let's say I could buy a laptop from France for £100, and that converted into €100. Okay, so the laptop in France cost €100. Exchange rate was 1 to 1. If the British pound appreciated by 100%, which never happened, but for simplicity of maths, and now each pound could now buy €2 instead of £1 buying €1. So that effective cost of the laptop for me has halved, because now all I have to do to buy that laptop for €100 is change £50 into €100, and then I can buy that laptop. Previously, I had to change £100, £100 into €100 to buy that laptop. And now the reverse is, for instance, if the British pound halved in value, so it became 50p to €1, I would have to pay £200 for that laptop instead of 50 previously. Well, 100 base, but actually, did I fuck up the first one? I might have. So basically, if the British pound can trade 2 to 1, I only have to pay £50 for that €100 laptop. If the pound halves in value, so weak pound, I have to pay £200 for €100 to buy a €100 laptop. Okay? Does everyone in the Discord call get that, or do you want me to do another example?
Get it.
Alright,
Thanks.
cracking. Trade blocks. We're almost done, so I think anyway. I don't know how many slides I've got left, so in case I'm boring you to death. You got preferential trade agreements, where typically two countries. Okay, so remember, if it is bilateral, it's between two countries. If it is multilateral, it's between lots of countries. So you got preferential trade areas, or if it's between two countries, it's an agreement. Essentially, they will remove some barriers to trade between them. So I can't get the words out of my mouth. They will have reduced some barriers to trade. So they might halve a tariff or remove a tariff on specific goods. They are not for everything preferential trade agreements. Okay? So, for instance, if we had a preferential trade agreement with France and they wanted to import cars and we wanted to import laptops, that would be our trade agreement. I would cut the tariff or remove the tariff on French laptops, which would make it easier for French laptops to be imported to the UK, bringing down the price of laptops overall in the UK, and they remove the barriers to trade, whatever they may be, a quota, a tariff, or anything, on British cars, and then France would have an overall cheaper price for cars because it increases competition. Then you got free trade areas where they remove all barriers to trade between countries. This still could be on specific goods, but it's typically on everything in free trade areas. So we just get rid of all the barriers to trade. Then you got customs unions. Customs unions, essentially, they have a common external tariff. Okay, so that is an important thing to know. Okay, so write it down if you're in the Discord call or watching this recorded. They have a common external tariff. Basically, they have free trade amongst each other. However, they share a tariff or a quota on a third-party nation. So, for instance, the EU is a customs union. all EU countries have the exact same quota or tariff on the UK. Okay, so they all share that same policy when it regards to us. They all share that same policy in regards to the US. They all share the same policy to anyone. But in between them, they have free trade. A common or a single market is very, very similar to a customs unions. However, a common market has common regulation. Okay, so you can really take the words out of these. So preferential, it gives preferential trade on some goods to some countries. Free trade, it gives free trade to some countries. Customs unions is not really easy to do with customs, but common market, okay, or single market, both are the same thing. They have common regulation or common policy. Okay, so in the EU is a common market. Mostly, okay, not 100%, but they're still a common market. They essentially said the EU itself, the governing body of the EU, decides regulations. So we say, for instance, a big thing about Brexit, which is interesting, was pillows, because the EU collectively had over 100 regulations on pillows being produced. So that is one example of a common market. They all had similar or the same, depending on domestic policy, about the regulations of making a pillow. Okay, so that's a common market. It's the same as customs union. Common external tariff, they literally just share regulations sometimes. And then you have monetary and or economic union. These are the highest levels of integration. Okay, these are your free movement of labour. So, for instance, I could go work in France if I wanted to when we were in the EU. Free movement of capital. I could, transfer my money from Germany to France without many issues. Labour and capital is a major thing, and monetary union, which is different to the economic union, which I just explained. Monetary union is where you share a currency. Okay, so the EU is the most obvious and maybe single example of a monetary union. The euro, they all share a currency. Okay, that's what a monetary union is. More about the EU. They're the largest trade bloc with an economy worth almost $18 trillion as GDP. That is, still $3 trillion less than the US. So, because the US GDP is 20.7 trillion GDP, if I can remember at the top of my head. EU internal trade was worth 3.4 trillion euros. So the total amount of money exported within the EU, so from Bulgaria to Greece or something, was worth 3.4 trillion, and that is massive amounts of economic trade and economic growth. You can tie that into growth massively. You can tie that into the benefits of the EU. The EU gives members money to develop their economy. Okay, so for instance, Cornwall was one of the largest recipients of EU funding in Europe. It went from, I can't remember the numbers, but it dropped to virtually nothing, the amount of money Cornwall was getting after we left the EU. So, big, very sad moment for Cornwall. Even though, the majority of them voted to leave the EU, even though the vast majority of their funding was from the EU. This ties into investment, okay? So you got foreign direct investment, although I wouldn't class it as that, I'd just say investment, because it's not really from individuals or firms abroad. Oh, actually no, you could, because it's still a governing institution. So yeah, foreign direct investment, that ties into. And that's helped developing and emerging economies across Europe. What factors have led to growth in the EU? Does there anyone in the call want to give me an example of what factors the EU has? Think about what we've been through on this PowerPoint. Also, Lewis?
I don't know, mate.
No. Okay. So the EU is full of democratic countries. So what has led to a growth in the EU is, stable government. Another thing that's led to growth in the EU, high education rates, very healthy population. Another factor, large population collectively, hundreds of millions of population collectively. So those are factors that had led to growth. You just need to take what we've done previously. Infrastructure, amazing infrastructure in the EU. Education, very high education levels. Some of the best education systems in the world. Healthcare, you got the best and some of free healthcare. Okay, and stable governments. Because apart from Ukraine, there's not really been many military coups in Europe. Or attempted military coups. So yeah, tie what you know about globalization in. However, there's a negative of the EU. Okay, that's meant to say EU GDP has, not HAS. I mistyped. Apologies. But it is very important to understand that when you're in a trade bloc, you are essentially tying your economies together. Okay? So imagine you're in a three-legged race, yeah? That is what being in a trade bloc is. If one of you falls, you are going to pull everyone else down with you. And if you talk about that, for the love of God, talk about the EU debt crisis. Greece alone almost brought down the entirety of the euro. Okay, so think about the EU as a 27-person or 27 country three-legged race. Everyone is tied to each other. If one trips, they all can fall. However, Greece had 3 bailouts worth hundreds of millions, if not billions, yeah? No, it was hundreds of billions, yeah. They had massive bailouts from Germany, the IMF, the World Bank, okay? So all the EU, Germany, World Bank, IMF all stepped in to save Greece, okay? So, and another important figure to remember, developed economies aim for 3% growth rate a year. Above that, cool, but they aim for a minimum of 3. Just like banks aiming for 2% inflation, developed economies aim for 3% growth. This dropped massively during the financial crisis, where the economy contracted by 4.3%, and during COVID, where the EU economy collectively contracted by 6%. Okay, that was in 2020 alone. So this shows how even though some countries like Sweden, didn't really get affected by COVID because they didn't introduce lockdown, they still economically were affected. You've got, I don't know what other countries, to be honest, but yeah, I don't know. I can't remember any specifics off the top of my head. Apologies, but yeah, you've tied your economies together. And remember that really bad PowerPoint I made on the EU debt crisis, where the Icelandic bank went bankrupt. That caused the PIGGS countries, PIGS countries, to go bankrupt. Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. There was another country beginning with G, which I can't remember, but the PIGGS countries. Ireland, that was it. PIIGS, my bad. Can't get everything right. But yes, so those are some important things to know. Botswana. If you want a case study on a country that became globalized and had giant levels of economic growth, choose Botswana. I will put a video in the chat as well. 5-minute video, basically explains everything, okay? Botswana was a southern African nation that gained its independence from the UK. It was the third poorest country in the world, with no, like literally, I think 1% of the population passing secondary education, massive amounts of disease, drought. The economy was propped up by the UK, otherwise the government would have gone bankrupt, okay? However, it had the largest economic growth in the world in a 3-year time span of 1971, 72, 73. Respectively, the economic growth rates were 25.8, 26.4 and 21%. You had a quarter of the economy added on each year. Developed economies are lucky if they get 3%. Botswana was doing 25%. And this is a perfect example if you want to use a country that shows about economic growth, because it has everything we have talked about, okay? It was initially, there was government and political stability, okay? So you got that key idea of the macro economy being stable because the government isn't collapsing. A loan was taken from the IMF, and that IMF, you got globalization. If you talk about IMF, you're bringing in globalization. They took a loan from the IMF and used it to buy tools to extract raw materials, which is another thing we've talked about, the extraction of raw materials being crucial to economic growth. This provided jobs and money to pay off that IMF loan. So not only did they pay off that loan, but they had more money than they invested because they sold those resources internationally. I can't remember what it's called. The return on investment. That's it. What's it called when you've got anyone in the call? When you've got the multiplier effect. That's it. You can bring the multiplier effect and the ROI, the return on investment. It was an export-focused economy, which also draws into globalization. Okay, and because it exported a lot, it strengthened its currency, which you need to remember as well, because, as I said, if there's a strong demand for a currency, that currency is going to be expensive and highly valued. Apologies if you can hear my dogs. They're getting taken out on a walk, so they're very excited. I don't know if you can hear that through my microphone. Yeah, you very much can, everyone on the recording. They're very excited, sorry. Anyway, carrying on. I'll just let them go down the stairs so you can hear me. They've gone. Okay. So you had investment into education, health and vaccines. They had universal healthcare, like in the UK. They had free healthcare. They had massive vaccine pushes, and they had an investment into education. These three drive into HDI, okay? Because they increase the years of education, because 90% of the country, compared to 1%, so it's currently 90, it was 1% when the country initially gained independence. 90% of the country can now access at least secondary education. Free healthcare, massive vaccine rollouts. And it created the South African Development Community, which was a trade bloc. Okay, I have no idea what type of trade bloc, but it was a trade bloc. But yeah, it created the South African Development Community, which ties into trade and globalization. So Botswana is the ideal nation to get some figures on, get an understanding of its growth. Right, you've got India. India's economy has been growing at around 6% a year, and it's expected to grow by about 7% per year post-COVID. So that's 2023 onwards, they expect around 7%. In a 10-year period between 2006 and 2016, 271 million people have been lifted out of poverty. That is, massive. And what factors have led to economic growth? You've got political stability, okay? Not so much now, because there's massive persecution of certain religious and ethnic groups, but that's quite a recent thing. But there's been no military coups, and there's been, democracy. It's the world's largest democracy. It has a giant population. It has a massive abundance of natural resources domestically. It has a lot of trade deals. For instance, we see a hell of a lot of our clothes being produced in India. That's through trade deals. And you have a large, cheap workforce. A lot of it is becoming educated over time. You've got China. 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty since the 1970s, I want to say. They've had massive economic boom, averaging 10% a year since 1990. And what factors might lead to their economic decline? Okay, so you need to think not just about growth, but about the opposite, about decline. The competition of India to China has been huge in its economic slowdown in recent years. You've got the increasing growth of the US economy as a competition to it. You've got growth of African economies like, Botswana. You've got Egypt, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Algeria becoming quite big powerhouses in African economics. The creation of an African Union to counterbalance China's economic influence in Africa has been huge to slowing it down. And the one thing that everyone thinks was China's miracle growth factor, a huge population, is now slowing it down because of the one-child policy. They don't have enough young workers. They have too many old people. Too many young people are having to take care of, 4 grandparents now. So it's become a massive burden on China. And another thing is China is currently going through the largest housing bubble in human history. And we are months, it's impossible to know, but weeks to months away from it bursting. So, basically, China's housing. What do I need to search up? China housing cost to price to income ratio. Images, maybe. Might have a graph. No, not a useful one. I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head. Yeah, but basically, their economy, the housing in Shanghai, I want to say is about 50 times the price of the average yearly income. Okay, so, if that bubble bursts, then the whole housing market internationally will decline, which is actually a good thing. That's the end of the presentation, because I couldn't be bothered to do more when actually making this. Is there any questions from anyone in Discord?
Nope.
No? Johnny, Matty, Sam, you all good? You all hyped about Monday?
Yeah, can't wait.
Alright, everyone's got this, I believe. Anyway, I'll stop the recording. Don't fail. Alright, bye.